My daughter-in-law said it right at my birthday party, in front of my friends, business partners, and my wife. Dad deserves to know the truth about the woman he has lived with for 43 years. The room that had been filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses suddenly fell into a deadly silence. Outside Lake Tahoe, the wind kept blowing, but inside this luxurious banquet hall time itself seemed to stop. I stood there. The crystal glass in my hand trembled slightly. At 73, I had built hundreds of buildings. I had faced financial crises and dangerous construction sites. But no blueprint had ever prepared me for this moment. Yena, my son's wife, stood straight. Her eyes were cold and calculating. She was not embarrassed at all. In fact, she seemed to enjoy the chaos she had just created. She pointed at Oriana, my gentle wife. Oriana was standing beside the large birthday cake. Her face had turned pale. The hands that were always warm were now gripping the edge of her dress tightly. Jenna continued with a mocking voice. She said Oriana was not as saintly as she looked. She accused my wife of once being the other woman who destroyed someone else's family. She claimed Oriana was secretly moving my assets away. Every word landed like a hammer, striking the foundation I had spent nearly half a century building. I looked at Baldwin, my only son. I waited for him to fight back. I waited for him to defend his mother. But no. Baldwin lowered his head. He avoided my eyes. Then he walked over to Jaina and placed his hand on her shoulder, as if silently agreeing with her. My heart tightened. It was a crack that could never be repaired in the structure of this family. My wife did not cry. She only looked at me. In her eyes was a deep pain. Her silence was not an admission. It was the endurance of someone who had spent her entire life holding this household together. My business partners began whispering. Concerned eyes turned toward us. The reputation I had spent a lifetime building was collapsing in just a few short minutes. In construction, we call this a chain collapse. When one critical pillar is destroyed, the entire structure falls with it. Jenna was not only attacking Oriana, she was attacking my honor. She wanted to level everything and build her own empire on the ruins. I took a deep breath. The cold mountain air made my lungs ache. I studied every face in the room. The triumph on my daughter-in-law's face. The cowardice of my son. The pain in the eyes of the woman who had shared my life. I have never been a man of empty words. I am a builder. And when a structure has a fatal flaw, the only solution is not to patch it. It is to tear it down and rebuild it from the ground up. Everyone watched me, waiting for an explosion of anger. They expected me to shout or throw Gina out. But I stayed silent. My silence was more frightening than any scream. I set my wine glass down on the table. The soft click of glass touching marble echoed sharply. And in that moment, I understood something. This was no longer a birthday party. This was a battlefield. And I had just been handed a map of the traitors. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, sit back and relax. And remember, the people in these stories always had every chance to behave with decency. They simply chose not to. Subscribe to the channel and comment number 1, so we can begin this intense story. And I am Gabriel, a builder. The silence that covered the Lake Tahoe banquet hall was not peaceful. It was the pause before a skyscraper collapses. I looked at Oriana. My wife stood there small and trembling beneath the dazzling chandeliers. Gina still wore a triumphant smile on her lips. She looked like an architect who had just placed the final charge of explosives at the foundation of my family. I turned to Baldwin, my son, the child I once carried in my arms across dusty construction sites. I had taught him that a real man protects those who are weaker than him, especially his own mother. But now he stood there like a rotten pillar. He did not say a single word to defend the woman who had carried him for 9 months and given him life. His eyes avoided mine, full of weakness and cowardly calculation. Jenna spoke again. Her voice was sharp like metal, scraping across glass. She talked about evidence. She talked about old files from decades ago. She wanted to turn the celebration of my life into a courtroom where my wife stood on trial. My longtime friends began stepping back. They did not want to be splashed by the mud Jenna was throwing around. I could feel the weight of 43 years of marriage pressing on my shoulders. In my mind, memories of Oriana appeared. Those early days when we started with nothing, when I was just a poor builder with empty hands. Oriana was there. She used her thin hands to cook cheap meals in our cramped rented apartment. She stayed awake through the night with me checking every technical drawing. She was the one who kept the balance of my life steady when money and temptation tried to pull me away. Looking into my wife's tear-filled eyes, I saw a deep fracture. It hurt more than any crack in concrete. Oriana did not try to defend herself. She knew that in a game already staged, the victim's words are often treated as weak excuses. She looked at me as if asking whether I believed those filthy accusations. I took a deep breath to hold back the rage boiling in my chest. A skilled builder never acts when his emotions are out of control. I needed to observe. I needed to analyze the entire structure of this conspiracy. Why did Gina choose today? Why was Baldwin so unusually silent? There had to be a hidden blueprint behind all of this that I had not yet fully seen. Betrayal from strangers only hurts, but betrayal from your own blood can break you. I saw greed in Jaina's eyes, and I saw cowardice in Baldwin's posture. They did not only want to humiliate Oriana, they wanted to erase her influence so they could manipulate me easily. To them, their own parents were just obstacles that had to be cleared away, so they could seize the family trust. I walked over to Oriana and placed my hand on her shoulder. Her shoulders were so fragile that I was afraid I might shatter her. I did not look at Jenna. I did not look at Baldwin. I looked directly at the guests. My voice was low but powerful, like the rumble of a compactor machine. I said that my family had encountered a small problem, and the party would end here. I thanked everyone for coming. People began leaving quickly. Gina and Baldwin looked at each other. They thought they had won. They believed the shock had crushed me, but they were wrong. In construction, when you discover that a structure has been hollowed out from inside, the first step is to isolate the damaged section before the collapse spreads. I helped Oriana into the car. The Lake Tahoe night was freezing cold. I drove in a frightening silence. But inside my mind, legal and financial calculations were racing. I was already drafting a new plan. A plan without mercy. When we arrived home, I let Oriana rest and quietly stepped into the backyard. The wind howled through the leaves, and in the darkness I suddenly heard the whispers of Baldwin and Jenna behind a large bush. "Everything is going according to plan, right?" Jenna asked impatiently. "Relax, that old man will not survive this blow. Mom was the only obstacle, and now she is finished." Baldwin replied in a tone I had never heard from him before. I stood frozen in the darkness. I never imagined that the son I had raised with such care, the boy I watched grow up, would for something greater than his own parents, throw away his humanity and become a beast hiding behind a human face. Standing in the darkness of the garden, I felt the cold from Lake Tahoe sink deep into my bones. But that cold was nothing compared to the fury freezing my heart. Baldwin's mocking laughter and Gina's sharp voice still echoed in my ears. They called my wife an obstacle, an enemy that needed to be removed. I closed my eyes. Memories from 43 years ago rushed back like an old but vivid film. Back then I had nothing but a faded set of work clothes and a burning ambition. Oriana was a young teacher with a bright future ahead of her. Yet she chose a penniless builder like me. She was not only my wife, she was the architect of my soul. In construction, if you want a building to stand strong, the foundation must be poured with the finest concrete. Oriana was that reinforced concrete. She sacrificed her career to care for the family. She used her gentle hands to grade papers every night and woke early each morning to cook meals for me to take to the construction site. I remember the stormy days when the company stood on the edge of bankruptcy. Oriana sold the only gold necklace she had, a keepsake from her mother. She placed the money in my hand and said, "I believe in your blueprint." Those hands are old now. The calluses and wrinkles on them are the scars of time. Proof of a life devoted entirely to her husband and her child. And now the very son she cherished wants to shatter her honor. Baldwin has forgotten who stayed awake all night when he had a fever. He has forgotten who sacrificed food and comfort to send him to study in England. He looks at the millions of dollars in assets and sees only numbers. He does not see his mother's sweat and tears inside them. In construction, the most dangerous design flaw happens when weak materials are used for load-bearing structures. I made a terrible mistake believing that giving Baldwin the very best would turn him into a strong pillar. I gave him money, status, and power, but I failed to teach him gratitude. The result is a hollow structure. A man willing to join forces with outsiders to destroy his own foundation. Gina is a variable I underestimated. She is not just greedy. She is a poisonous termite silently eating away at my son's dignity from within. With sweet promises of a powerful future, she turned Baldwin into a puppet. They want control of the family trust. They want to turn Oriana into a criminal so they can strip away her inheritance rights. I leaned against the trunk of an old pine tree. My breathing was heavy. I looked toward the brightly lit mansion. It used to symbolize success and happiness, but now in my eyes it was simply a structure with fatal flaws. A structure that must be dismantled to protect the true foundations. I was no longer sad. Pain had transformed into a cold clarity. An old builder never fears starting again from the ground up. I began analyzing their weaknesses. Baldwin depends entirely on my financial support. Jenna is far too confident in her cunning. They believe I am just an old man past his time, someone who sits quietly among old bricks. But they forgot one thing. I am the man who wrote the rules of this game. I understand every corner of the legal system I use to protect my empire. If they want to play a game of destruction, I will show them what a real reconstruction looks like. I quietly walked back into the house. Passing through the living room, I saw Baldwin sitting with a glass of wine, his face calm as if nothing had happened. He looked at me and asked, "Dad, are you all right?" I looked deeply into his eyes, trying to find the image of the little boy he once was, but finding only emptiness. I nodded gently and gave him a mysterious smile. A smile that, if Baldwin were perceptive enough, he would realize that the storm had only just begun. I walked into my office and picked up the phone to call my personal lawyer. "Michael, I need you to prepare a full review of the entire power structure of the family trust." Immediately, I hung up. This war would not be fought with tears. It would be fought with numbers and ironclad contract clauses. But before that, I needed to uncover another truth. A truth Jenna was trying to hide behind her accusations against my wife. Because I know one thing for certain. The person who talks the most about betrayal is usually the one committing it in the most sophisticated way. I stood hidden behind the dense pine branches. I held my breath, hearing only the heavy pounding of my aging heart in my chest. A few meters away, beneath the dim yellow light of the garden path, two figures stood close together, Baldwin and Gina. They had no idea that the senile old man they had just mocked was standing right inside the blind corner of the blueprint they had designed themselves. Jenna's voice rang out sharp as a blade freshly sharpened. She let out a cold laugh. A laugh that made my skin crawl. She said the scene at the party was only the beginning. The purpose had not been to humiliate Oriana for entertainment. It was a strategy of isolation. She wanted to separate Oriana from me. She wanted to turn my wife into a toxic presence so she could rightfully demand that I strip Oriana of control over the family trust. I clenched my fists. Baldwin, my son, stood there nodding. There was not even a hint of resistance in him. He said he was tired of waiting, tired of stretching out his hand every month to receive an allowance. He wanted power. He wanted control. He wanted to turn the assets that his mother and I had built with sweat and sacrifice into gambling chips on his own table. Then Baldwin said something that shattered my entire world. He called the mother who had sacrificed her life for him an obstacle. He told Jenna that once they brought his mother down, manipulating a grieving old man like me would be as easy as flipping a hand. When I heard that, the blood in my veins boiled and then instantly froze. In construction, when a wall leaks, you can repaint it. But when the steel reinforcement has completely corroded, that wall is simply waiting to collapse. Baldwin was no longer the son I once knew. Greed and Jenna's influence had eaten him down to the core. They had no compassion for the woman who had spent her life worrying about them. I quietly stepped back. I walked across the grass carefully so I would not make a sound. In my mind, a new map of power was already taking shape. I was no longer a forgiving father. I was a contractor, facing a serious case of structural fraud. And my first rule was simple. Never allow the saboteurs to control the blueprint. I entered my study and locked the door. I opened the safe and took out the folders I had prepared years ago as a contingency plan. I had built many buildings designed to withstand a level 9 earthquake. I had also built a legal structure to protect Oriana in the worst-case scenario. I simply never imagined that the disaster would come from my own son. I studied Baldwin's spending records, luxury purchases for Jenna, gambling debts I had quietly paid to protect the family's reputation. All of it now became bricks for the financial prison I would build around them. They wanted privilege. I would show them where real privilege came from. An idea flashed through my mind. If Jenna could dig through my wife's past, then I could sweep away Jenna's future. I knew she was not as simple as she appeared. A woman capable of calmly destroying a family for profit surely had cracks in her own personal blueprint. I picked up the phone. I called an old friend, a man who specialized in handling certain technical problems that the law sometimes could not reach directly. I needed information about Jenna's connections at the company where Baldwin worked. Tomorrow the structure of this family would change forever. I silently promised myself. I glanced at the wedding photo of Oriana and me on my desk. My wife was smiling gently. She had no idea that her old builder was beginning the most ruthless reconstruction of his life. But there is one thing I have not told you yet. Something even I only discovered when I turned to the last page of the confidential file about Gina. A secret that could drive Baldwin insane when he learns what kind of person he truly brought into this house. I sat in the darkness of my study. The only light came from the computer screen running lines of financial statements. Outside, the wind from Lake Tahoe howled again and again like a lament for a structure collapsing. I looked at the file on Gina. Pieces of deception were beginning to reveal themselves. But before taking the next step, I paused. I thought about you. The people sitting in front of your screens, listening to my story. In life, we spend decades building. We build houses, we build careers, and most importantly, we build families. We believe that if we pour enough sweat and love into that foundation, it will last forever. But sometimes the one swinging the sledgehammer that destroys everything is the very person we once loved the most. That feeling is not just pain. It is emptiness. Like standing in a room you once painted with your own hands, only to find it completely hollow. Baldwin's betrayal forced me to face a brutal truth. We can give our children money. We can give them the best education. But we cannot buy compassion or integrity for them. I was wrong to believe that abundance would create kindness. Without realizing it, I turned my own son into a parasite. A man who looks at his parents' life work as a debt we owe him simply for his existence. Tonight I am not only confronting Gina and Baldwin. I am confronting my own mistakes from the past. I must correct this design flaw before it is too late. I must protect Oriana. She is the last brick holding together the integrity of the man I am after so many years fighting in the business world. If I step back now, the sacrifices Oriana made for 45 years will become meaningless. I will not allow that to happen. A responsible builder never abandons a structure that has become dangerous. I will dismantle the rotten sections. I will cut away the tumors of greed no matter how much pain it causes me. I picked up my fountain pen and signed the order to freeze the secondary accounts. The scratching sound of the pen across the paper felt like thunder announcing a purge. But that was not all. I had just received an audio file from my old friend. It recorded a conversation between Jenna and an unfamiliar man, and the name mentioned inside it made a chill run down my spine at the depth of my daughter-in-law's malice. Their map of power has a flaw they do not even realize exists, and I am about to place the final charge of explosives right into that weakness. The next morning, Lake Tahoe lay beneath a thick blanket of fog. The cold air felt like a silent indictment. I had not slept for a single minute. I just sat there watching the numbers dance across the computer screen. For a builder, numbers never lie. They are the language of truth. And the truth right now was simple. Baldwin and Jenna were living inside a sandcastle I had built. I picked up the phone and called Michael, my personal lawyer. He had worked for me for 30 years. Michael understood every corner of my asset structure better than anyone else. I asked him to conduct an emergency structural inspection. I did not want arguments. I did not want shouting. I wanted to use the law and the numbers to restore order. That is how an old builder handles a hollowed-out structure. I instructed Michael to activate the clause protecting the core assets in the family trust. I ordered him to cut off every financial supply line to the secondary accounts starting at 9 o'clock this morning. In construction, when a beam begins to sag, you use hydraulic jacks to lift it and replace it with a steel beam. The process is painful and expensive, but if you do not do it, the entire building collapses. Baldwin had grown used to being spoiled. He treated his parents' sacrifices as a built-in privilege. He treated the $8,000 monthly allowance as the oxygen he breathed. He treated the luxury apartment in San Francisco as if it were part of his own body. I was about to show him that all of those things were nothing more than temporary scaffolding, and I had just decided to dismantle them. I walked downstairs. Oriana was sitting at the dining table. She looked several pounds thinner after only one night. Her eyes were red from crying. I stepped closer and placed my hand over her trembling hands. I told her everything would be all right. I would repair this blueprint. She looked at me with complete trust. She knew that once I picked up the plans, I would not stop until the structure was rebuilt. At that moment, the front door burst open. Baldwin and Gina walked in. They looked energized. Perhaps they had just finished celebrating after last night's performance. Gina looked at me with open challenge, her chin still lifted in arrogance. Baldwin looked away. I stood up. I did not look at them with anger. I looked at them with technical inspection. I asked them both to sit down. My voice was low and steady like a hammer striking an anvil. Gina laughed mockingly. She asked if I planned to lecture them again. She said the truth about my wife was already clear. I said nothing. I pushed a folder across the table. This is a notice from my legal office. All credit cards under your names have been locked. The monthly allowance has been suspended indefinitely, and Baldwin has 48 hours to move out of the luxury apartment. The room fell into a terrifying silence. Baldwin's face turned from red to pale. Gina jumped to her feet. She hissed that I could not do this. She said those were family assets. I looked straight into her eyes and said she was right. They were family assets, and I was the only person who decided who was allowed to use them. A structure cannot continue feeding the people, trying to destroy its foundation. Baldwin stammered, asking why I would do this. He said I was ruining his life. I stood straight and told him I was teaching him how to build his own life. He was an adult now. His life and his wife's life should not depend on two aging bodies anymore. Gina clenched her teeth. She knew she had just hit a steel wall. She turned toward Baldwin, signaling him. But I knew this was only the beginning. I still held another card. An audio file recording Jenna's secret conversation with a strange man. This man played a critical role in Jenna's plan. And my son had no idea he was only an outsider in that plan. If you have followed the story this far, help us with something quick. Subscribe and comment number 2 so we can continue the story about this mysterious man. The luxurious living room suddenly felt suffocating like an airless basement. Baldwin stood frozen in place, his face twisted with shock. He could not believe that the father who had always been forgiving could cut off the electricity powering his lavish life so quickly. Gina was different. She was not shocked. She was furious. Her eyes burned like someone who had just had a prize snatched away from her mouth. "You have no right to do this," Jenna shouted. Her voice lost its usual polished elegance. "Baldwin is the only heir. You are violating family morality." I looked at her. My gaze was as cold as the surface of Lake Tahoe in winter. In construction, when a project is halted because of violations, the contractor is usually the one shouting the loudest, because they fear the loss. Gina was the same. She did not care about family morality. She only cared about the numbers in the accounts she had grown used to spending. I turned to Baldwin. He was trembling. He grabbed his phone and tried to log into his banking app. But every attempt was useless. "Dad, did you really lock everything? I have debts due at the end of the month. I have office rent to pay. Are you planning to throw me out onto the street?" I replied in a calm tone. I told him the street is the best place to learn the strength of the ground beneath your feet. If you cannot stand on your own two legs, then luxury apartments and $1,000 allowances are nothing more than rotten scaffolding. I told him I had supported him for too long. That support had turned into a default privilege in his mind. And that was my design flaw. Now I was correcting it. Jenna stepped closer to me. She tried to use her sharpness as a weapon. She said that if I did not reopen the accounts, she would release more truths about Oriana on social media. She threatened to destroy my family's reputation forever. I smiled, a smile that made Gina hesitate. I told her that a builder's reputation is not based on what people say. It is based on the quality of the houses he has built. Oriana built the character of thousands of students. That is a structure that will stand forever, and her dirty words will never reach it. Then I asked her if she was absolutely sure that her own personnel file at the financial firm where she worked was completely clean. Gina's face suddenly turned pale. Her confidence began to crack. I knew I had touched the weak point. In the audio file the investigator sent me, one name had appeared again and again. It was not Baldwin's. It was the name of her direct supervisor at the investment firm. And they were not only discussing work. They were discussing how to use Baldwin's position to seize real estate projects that belonged to me. Baldwin looked at his wife. He began to sense something was wrong in the air. "Gina, what is Dad talking about?" What file? Gina did not answer. She stared at me with pure hatred. She knew I had uncovered her hidden blueprint. I stood up and straightened my jacket. I told Baldwin that the 48 hours started now. If his belongings were still in the San Francisco apartment after that time, I would send a crew to remove everything and dump it at the landfill. I said it with the finality of a builder disposing of construction waste. I walked out of the living room, leaving behind the sound of an argument exploding between the two traitors. Their alliance was built on profit, and once the profit was cut off, that structure would begin to destroy itself. But I had not delivered the final blow yet. I was waiting for a phone call. A call confirming that Jenna had signed the agreement trading one of my projects with that supervisor. I returned to my office, leaving Jenna's shouting and Baldwin's cowardly silence behind me. I sat down in the familiar leather chair. On the desk was a small recording device. I pressed play. Once again, Gina's voice filled the room. But this time it was not the bitter tone she used with me. It was a seductive voice. Calculated intimacy directed toward a man named Richard, her boss, the man who had been eyeing my development land. She had not only betrayed my family, she had betrayed the very marriage she used as her cover. After a moment of silence, I called Baldwin and Gina into the room for one final conversation. They walked in with completely different expressions. Baldwin looked like a man who had barely survived a tunnel collapse. His eyes were bloodshot and his hair was disheveled. Gina, on the other hand, still tried to maintain a cold and arrogant composure. I looked at Baldwin and asked him if he knew why Jenna had been so eager to destroy his mother's reputation. Baldwin looked at his wife, then back at me, stammering without an answer. I knew he understood part of it, but not the whole truth. I did not keep him waiting long. I pushed the recording device forward. The sounds of betrayal filled the room. Jenna laughing about how easy Baldwin was to manipulate. Jenna promising Richard that once she secured control of the family trust, she would transfer the entire Lake Tahoe project to his corporation. The room fell into absolute silence. So silent that I could hear my son's broken breathing. Baldwin's face turned from pale white to a deep shade of purple. He looked at Jenna. The weakness in his eyes was gone. What remained was the shattering of blind faith. He finally realized that the woman he defended at all costs saw him as nothing more than a bargaining chip for her career. Gina tried to speak. She tried to call it a business connection. She tried to argue that it was her way of protecting their future. But I stopped her. I placed another file on the table. It contained evidence that Gina had been embezzling funds from Richard's company to cover her personal debts. Betrayal stacked upon betrayal. A blueprint filled with cracks of fraud. I told Jenna she had calculated everything very well, but she had forgotten one basic principle. When you build a conspiracy on lies, you are building a house on sinking sand, and sinking sand never keeps secrets. I gave her two choices. Either she signs the voluntary divorce papers and leaves this house with nothing, or within 5 minutes I send the entire file to Richard and the economic crime investigators. Gina collapsed completely. She dropped to her knees on the marble floor. The arrogance was gone. The threats were gone. She was nothing more than a corrupt contractor caught red-handed at the site. Baldwin stared at his wife. I could tell he wanted to do something terrible in that moment, but I stopped him before things went too far. Then he turned to look at me. For the first time in years, I saw real regret in his eyes. He started to step closer, as if he wanted to apologize. But I raised my hand and stopped him. Forgiveness is not something that can be patched together with a few words. I told Baldwin that he had chosen to stand beside a traitor. He had called his own mother an obstacle, and now he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I stood up and looked at the two broken figures sitting among the ruins of their own making. Did I feel satisfied? No. I only felt the relief of a builder who had just removed a dangerous structural threat. I told them both to leave immediately. But as they reached the door, I suddenly remembered one detail in the file that I had not revealed yet. A detail about the man named Richard. He was not only Jenna's boss. He also had another connection to my family's past. A connection that could make this entire situation far more complicated than any of us had imagined. Gina left in a state of complete psychological collapse. She no longer carried the presence of a proud daughter-in-law. She was nothing more than a defeated player whose masks had all been torn away. In the study, only Baldwin and I remained. My son stood there, exhausted like the frame of a house after a fire. He did not dare look into my eyes. He did not dare look at the photograph of his mother on the desk. I sat down and felt the heavy silence between us. In construction, after you demolish a defective structure, the hardest part is clearing the debris. Baldwin was that debris. I looked at him and saw a painful failure in my role as a father. I had built skyscrapers strong enough to survive any storm. Yet I had allowed my son to collapse before a greedy woman. "Dad," Baldwin spoke. His voice was hoarse. "I am sorry. I was blind." I cut him off with a firm raised hand. I told him that an apology at this moment was nothing more than cheap paint covering deep cracks. He had betrayed my trust. He had stood by while Gina humiliated his mother in front of everyone. Worse than that, he had treated Oriana's sacrifices as an obstacle. That betrayal could not be erased with a single sentence. I gave Baldwin two brutal choices. One, he could follow Jenna and continue sinking deeper into deception and schemes. Or two, he could accept a complete purge of everything he knew. He would give up every privilege he had. He would start again from zero at a construction site far from the city. He would work as a laborer's assistant. He would learn the weight of real work and understand the value of every dollar and every ounce of respect. I looked directly into his eyes. I told him I would draw a clear boundary. I would not cut off blood ties, but I would cut off financial dependence. If he could not build his own character, then he did not deserve to inherit anything from the structure of my life's work. Baldwin stayed silent for a long time. Finally, he nodded. Real tears of regret began to fall. This time I believed it was not a script written by Jenna. The collapse of the alliance between the two conspirators was complete. Jenna signed the divorce papers and disappeared from our lives to face legal trouble at her former company. Baldwin packed his suitcase and left the house that same night, beginning a long journey of redemption. Justice had been served. Yet my heart felt no relief. I stepped onto the balcony and looked out across Lake Tahoe. The fog had cleared, revealing water as clear as crystal. I thought about Oriana. She was still inside the house trying to heal her wounded heart. I knew I needed to do something greater to honor her. Something that would place her name where it truly belonged in the history of our family. I walked back into the room and picked up the phone to call Michael once more. I asked him to prepare the paperwork to sell the luxury apartment in San Francisco. The entire sum would not go into the family trust. It would be used to establish a scholarship foundation in Oriana's name. We would support young teachers with passion but limited financial means. It would become a permanent monument to her sacrifice. But just as I was about to sign the final decision, an unfamiliar email appeared in my private inbox. The subject line contained only one sentence: "The truth about Richard and Oriana 43 years ago." My hand trembled. My heart skipped a beat. There was a part of history I had never known. A piece of the foundation that even Oriana had never told me about. I sat motionless in front of the computer screen. The words in the email felt like the final bricks snapping into place in a blueprint that had been incomplete for 43 years. Richard, Gina's boss, was not a stranger. He was the son of the man who had once tried to stop Oriana and me from being together. His hatred was not about money. It was a poisonous inheritance passed down from the past. I looked over at Oriana. She walked into the room carrying 2 cups of warm tea. I said nothing about the email. Some secrets are better buried deep beneath the foundation of peace. I took her thin hands in mine, hands that had built an entire empire with me out of nothing. I told her about the scholarship foundation that would carry her name. I saw a small spark return to the eyes that had been heavy with sorrow. Baldwin had already begun his work at the construction site far from the city. He sent me a photo of his hands covered with blisters from holding a shovel. He did not complain. He was beginning to understand that to build a house you must start from the lowest bricks. I kept my distance. I did not help him, but I watched. That was my way of helping my son rebuild his character. A family is not built with wealth. It is built with respect. Money can create dependence, but only sincerity can preserve trust. I spent my entire life constructing buildings of concrete, yet only at the end of my life did I realize that the most important structure is the peace inside the heart of the woman I love. We sat together on the balcony overlooking Lake Tahoe. The sound of the waves gently touching the shore reminded us of the permanence of true values. The storm had passed. The traitors were gone. The structure of my family might now be smaller, but it was stronger than ever. If my story made you reflect on respect within a family and the boundaries that must be protected, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next story. Thank you for staying with Dad's Real Life Revenge. I will see you again in the next blueprint of life.